having it all, doing it all. It's the elusive dream, and it's the thing we probably all think everyone else online is doing, so clearly there must be something wrong with us for not being able to manage it all. Welcome to a special solo episode of The Maker's Playbook, the podcast where we talk all about what it's really like to make a living from the things you make. And sometimes that reality is the to-do list that feels impossible. I'm your host, Rebecca Icaskara, and I've been managing that ridiculous self-employed to-do list for the last 11 years. And this week, I'm here by myself without a guest to share some of the hard-earned lessons I've garnished over this last decade in business, with the hope that a couple of these time management tricks helps ease your own overwhelming to-do list. So for starters, a spoiler alert. Even though I titled this podcast episode, How I Do It All, I definitely do not do it all alone. Now, don't go hitting skip on this episode on me already. I wasn't trying to make that title such a clickbait thing, I promise. Because to a lot of people, managing 2 photography studios, running this podcast, launching an online course, and still getting somewhere between 6 to 8 hours of sleep a night is doing it all. But I could easily show you my list of things I'm not doing, or the things I feel like I'm failing at, quite frankly. So I just want to be realistic with you before we dive into some very, very practical tools for how I do actually manage 2 photography studios, start a podcast, launch an online course, coach other makers on their own businesses, and on the days I'm particularly lucky, sit down at the wheel and get my hands muddy. So first up, a reality check. Because if the online educators you're listening to aren't giving you the context of their lives, well, then I'm awfully skeptical of their advice. So, I am a 34-year-old self-employed woman with a rescue dog, a fixer-upper house, and an equally self-employed husband who literally does all of the cooking. And therefore, he does 90% of the grocery shopping. He's also damn good at that cooking, so when you look up the term married up, you'll find a photo of me smiling away. Now, we do not yet have kids, but we do want them. Calm down, Mom. So, I am acutely aware that the 12-hour computer screen workday is not a reliable long-term solution, even though that sometimes sneaks into my current reality right now because I'm recording this episode during wedding season, and that happens a little bit more than I would even like to admit it, but I am here to be honest with you. And while I would love for ceramics to take over, the wedding photography business is still where the bulk of my income comes from. I will say though, many of the tips I'm about to share with you here I learned from some dear friends of mine who are parents of 2 little ones under the age of 4, and who run not one massively successful business, but 3. So for all of you parents listening right now who have already started to tune me out thinking, her life isn't like mine, so this isn't going to work, I challenge you to stick around. Or better yet, send me a DM at The Maker's Playbook, and I'll introduce you to my friend Jeff. Look, I have been in enough conference room breakout sessions over the years, hearing some single guy up on stage basically saying, well, if you aren't achieving what I'm achieving, you just aren't working hard enough, more times than I can count. And I've also wanted to slap that guy across the face more times than I can count. While there is something to be said for calling people out, because sure, if your average Netflix time per week is creeping above 10 hours, and you're telling me you don't have enough time in the day, well, then, yeah, I'll call bullshit too. But also, I have tried the head down and work for years, and still didn't get as far as I wanted to, or as far as that dude on stage seems to have gotten. So one thing I can promise you today is that I am absolutely not going to sit here and ignore the privilege for different people's lives and lifestyles. The single bros out there with no life outside of work, well, one day they're going to get burnt out and have a come to Jesus midlife crisis moment. And how can I say that with such confidence? Because I've also heard those conference speakers up on stage as well. We aren't about that life here at the Maker's Playbook. What I want to do today is share with you the sustainable, life-giving tactics I've learned over the last 11 years of running a business to not just succeed at your to-do list, but to actually build a life you love. Because here's the really annoying thing. Most people who are traditionally employed, working for someone else from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, dream of the day that they can quit that job and make their side hustle the full-time work. They think, if only I had more time, then whatever problem would be solved. Well, guess what? As someone who has controlled her own schedule for the last 11 years with no other employer other than myself telling me what to do and how to use my time, there's still not enough time. At least that's the case if you aren't hyper, ridiculously, borderline obsessive about being intentional with your time. Here's what happens when you're self-employed. Or at least if you're starting out as a solopreneur, as the hashtag goes, meaning you're a one-person shop with little to no additional employees or support staff. You quit that full-time job, and then, instead of having all the freedom in the world to go get your hair cut in the middle of the day on a Wednesday, or read a book in the sun on a Tuesday when the weather just happens to be so perfect, you wind up working every day of the week for more hours than you worked for that other guy. Sure, some of this is because you love what you do. And when it was a side hustle, you did it on the weekends anyways, right? So what's the big deal? But some of it also is because now, as the one-person shop, you are not only maker and seller, you are also CEO, chief marketing officer, primary customer service contact, studio assistant, housekeeper, and so much more. And all of those roles take time. More often than not, self-employed artists and makers wind up feeling like they've traded in a job where they could close the computer at 5 p.m. on a Friday and not think about it again until 9 a.m. on a Monday. Or put in their vacation request days and go ignore the world for 2 weeks on a beach somewhere. They feel like they've traded that for a job that never actually ends. And sure, we do love what we do, but that doesn't mean we don't also need a break. It doesn't mean you don't also need to set an end time to your work days, even if you are just working from home. Sure, you get endless PTO, but do you ever actually schedule those days off when you're self-employed? Do not get me wrong. I can't envision going back to work for someone else. And I do love what I do. But it also has taken a lot of hard work and practice to start to have some semblance of that elusive work-life balance. And if you can start to implement these tools and tricks before you're full-time, well, then you're just going to be one massive step ahead when the time comes to take that leap. And I want to be clear here before we dive into the nitty-gritty pragmatic steps and tactics that I have prepared for you. All of these tools and tricks are a practice, meaning be gentle with yourself. There will be good days and bad. There are weeks when I abide by these structures, and those weeks are beautiful. I feel in control of my to-do list, and I feel comfortable closing the computer down at a reasonable hour and enjoying dinner with Francesco and a long evening walk with Hendrix. And then there are days or weeks when I don't practice these techniques. When I think, oh, I'll just quickly handle this email right now, even though it's not the time I set aside for email. And then 12 hours later, I still haven't gotten done what I wanted to get done that day. And I'm flopping down into bed, feeling exhausted, and like I totally failed at the day. I'm not perfect at this stuff. But I am aware enough of what's going on to know why those 12-hour days have happened and what I should be doing to fix them. My project and time management skills have progressed through various stages over the years. I have always been a planner and someone rather obsessed with systems, admittedly. I could see quite easily in those early years of how so many fellow photographers were wasting their time without systems in place. They'd sit down at a computer at the start of a workday and spend the first hour just figuring out what they actually needed to do. Yeah, no, that's not sustainable. Don't be doing that. I spend zero time figuring out what I need to do for our clients on any given day because it is all completely systematized. Every time we book a new client, their entire workflow from signing a contract to sending out invoices to knowing what date I will be delivering their full gallery of photos on is automatically populated in my office management system. How all of that works is a conversation for another podcast episode because I could deep dive down that rabbit hole for quite a long time. And I promise you, there is a way for it to work for a maker's business. There are not exceptions to this rule. So if you're interested in learning more about that, just send me an email right now at Rebecca, Rebecca, at makers-playbook.com, and we can nerd out on some systems together. Because there's no reason this massive time saver can't be used for shop update schedules, pre-order launches, custom orders, whatever else you have going on. This kind of repeating task work should not take up brain space for you, nor should much time during the day be spent trying to sort out what needs to get done. So that's tip number 1. Automate a to-do list for your client and customer work. All right, so doing that put me ahead of the curve for the first few years, without question. But if you want to grow a business, you can't only spend your time reacting and responding to customers. You need time to sort out a marketing plan to actually get those customers in the first place. As we heard from Sandy Lockwood in episode 106, especially for us makers and artists, you need time to play, to brainstorm, to ideate new ideas in order to actually, maybe one day discover your own unique style. In other words, you need time to make stuff for fun, not because you have to fulfill an order. And when your day is dictated by your inbox and customer service, then I can promise you that time for play feels like it never exists. For years, I would sort out a daily to-do list the night before, including that automated client to-do list, and then whatever other tasks I needed to get done inside of the business, like website updates or Instagram post scheduling or whatever. And then I took this a step further and wrote down the estimated amount of time I would think each task would take me. I would then look at the next day's schedule, realize how many hours I actually had sitting at my desk to get work done, working between meetings and phone calls, needing to drive somewhere for a shoot, all of the other things that are going on to successfully run the business, but also, just life. And then I would adjust that to-do list to fit the actual hours I had in the day. Because let's be honest, the list was always longer than the day could hold. And that worked for a while. Mostly it worked to stay exactly where I was. It didn't work to actually grow the business or to change the business. Because at its core, that approach was still being dictated by everyone else. Clients scheduling shoots or networking meetings or phone calls, all of these outside forces were being dropped into my calendar first, and then I was trying to figure out a way to fit in all the rest around them. If I had tried to launch this podcast using that time management system, this podcast wouldn't exist. Why? Because in that world, the world where everyone else dictates your calendar first, and then you have to squeeze in what you want around whatever is left over, the seemingly urgent work always gets done first. The emails, the client needs, the responses to your boss, whatever else it might be, the big, audacious, exciting new projects that don't actually have deadlines, those projects seldom rise to the top of the list, and they never make it into your inbox. And if there is one thing this podcast has taught me over the last year, is that for us as artists and makers, it is crucial to have time for ourselves to play, to brainstorm in our medium, and ideate new creations. None of which is ever going to feel urgent, especially if you have a bunch of customers that want to buy what you're already making. Time and time, I've asked the guests here on the podcast, how did you find your unique style? What did you do to discover that amazing technique that you do now? And time again, the answer is experiment. Try out new things. Play around without needing it to turn out. So when the world has a million different notification alarms buzzing in your pocket, between emails, texts, Instagram, and all the rest of it, how do you manage your time to do it all? How did I launch a brand new online course in the middle of moving into a new house, which also happened to be right at the start of my busiest time of year for photography? A year made even crazier with all the 2020 COVID rescheduling and the ongoing uncertainty. Well, here we go. Settle in. Maybe hit pause and get a pen and paper. Or just listen to this all, soak it in, and then come back and listen again with a pen and paper. I did this all thanks to focus, flow, and flex. Now, let me give credit where credit is due before I explain what the heck those terms mean. This concept is from a book called Traction. And while the book sat unread on my shelf for years and is still unread on my shelf, I actually learned this time management way thanks to some friends of mine, Jeff and Aaron Youngren. You know, the ones that I mentioned earlier at the start of this episode, with 2 little ones, 3 ridiculously successful businesses, and also they take like a 2 to 3, sometimes 4-week vacation in the middle of wedding season as photographers, you know, to go on vacation with their family and not touch their inbox. So, my friends, this stuff works. All right? So what is it? Focus, flow, and flex. Essentially, it's time blocking. But it's time blocking on steroids. So here's the deal. Multitasking is a myth. I think most people know this by now, but just in case, multitasking is really just switching between tasks rapidly. You can't actually do 2 things at once. But what we know now, thanks to science and a lot of studies that you can go look up on Google, is that every time you switch between disparate tasks, you lose a minimum of 23 minutes. 23 minutes, you guys! That's a third of every hour. Can you imagine what kind of breathing space you would have in your days if you had an extra third of a day back? This frightening phenomenon is called context switching. That term, context switching, was originally used to talk about computers, so if you do go Google it, you're going to see some articles about computers, but also some about humans. So, I'm just going to let you go ahead and Google that. If you don't believe me on these stats, we're not going to take any more time of this episode on that. That's all just to say, it's nuts. As much as we think we're being efficient, as much as we think we're getting multiple things done at once, what we're really doing is losing a lot of time. So, the idea of focus, flow, and flex is to block off chunks of time for specific kinds of tasks. During those given segments, you do not do anything else outside of what is in that range of specific kinds of tasks. Focus time. That is for your big, most important work. Note that I said important work, not urgent work. For example, when I was writing the lessons for the Maker's Photography Styling System, that was important work. It wasn't urgent because, frankly, I hadn't even told anyone I was doing it yet. There was no public deadline to be met, no ticking time plug-in on a website. But if I wanted to take on the audacious goal of launching an online course, I needed to set aside some serious time to dig in and write the darn thing. And in order to get that done, I set aside my focus time for it. Which means I was not jumping into my inbox, responding to a customer request within 2 minutes of receiving that email, while also trying to write one of the over 15 different lessons inside of this course. The course launched this past July, quite simply because of focus time. There is no other way it would have happened as quickly as it did. Because take note, it launched in July. We moved in May. Wedding season started in May. Everything was crazy by July, right? So, focus time is for your big, most important work. Generally, that's something that's going to be associated with a long-term goal. If you're side hustling your ceramics right now and you want to be able to one day quit your full-time job, maybe even by the end of this year, and go full-time with your ceramics, then your focus time might be spent predominantly on figuring out the details of setting up a business. Researching what you need to know about insurance and taxes and setting up a website or getting a personalized email address, etc., etc., etc. Focus time is for the really important stuff that will ultimately move your biggest goals forward, but typically isn't something anyone is pressing on you for a deadline. Deadline urgent stuff is for flow time. Flow time is the everyday needs of keeping a business functioning. It's responding to emails, finishing client work, or for those of you side hustlers, flow time is basically your day job. And to be clear, something that's maybe going to come as a surprise, when I say flow time is for client work, for us makers, that means making work for something like a shop update is actually flow time. Editing photos for me is flow time, not focus time. And I want to be abundantly clear about that because your focus time should be blocked off on your calendar for the best hours of your day. What do I mean by best? I mean, what is that time of day when you are the most productive? When you are, frankly, the most focused? For me, it's the morning. It's between 7 a.m. and 1 p.m. are my best working hours. Even more specific than that, from about 8 a.m. to 11 a.m. are really my prime time working hours. So 8 to 11 is my focus time. In a perfect world, that focus time would be daily. But I'm a one-woman shop over here. So during certain times of the year, aka right now, during wedding season, that focus block from 8 to 11 a.m. is more like 3 times a week. Okay, before I dig more into this, let's finish the list. So focus time is your big important work that you have to get done in order to accomplish long-term goals, but it isn't necessarily pressing urgent. Flow time is for your everyday demands, the things that feel far more urgent, and then you basically have to get them done in order to stay employed. And flex time is effectively bonus. Flex time can be whatever it needs to be. Flex time is often the thing that I don't actually save my time for on my schedule, to be honest. But it is absolutely 100% needed. And when you do block that time off, your days generally feel better. Because how often does the day go perfectly to plan? When you factor in flex time, you have more breathing room to make up for when things don't actually go to plan. Flex time can be what you need it to be. If you need to run and pick up the dry cleaning, do it in your flex time. Jonesing to go check in on Instagram today? Flex time. Flex time is it would be nice to do this, but at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter that much if I get it done exactly today or not kind of stuff. It's also the time of day that should be your least productive. I'm never going to have flex time in the morning because that would just start my day off completely distracted. And then when I try and focus, I've got a million other things going on inside my mind if I started off with something like Instagram. Now here's the thing. You want to be sure these blocks of time are at least 3 to 4 hours, at least especially for focus time. You aren't going to take any meaningful steps forward on a big project, something like building a website or launching a new product line, by working on it in 20-minute increments. let's be sensible. For most people, and if we're honest with ourselves, we're probably not as much of an exception to the human rule as we like to think we are. And I'm saying this out loud for myself here. I thought for years that I was the exception and that clearly I excelled at multitasking. So for most people, it takes us a bit of time to get our heads into the game, to get into a groove if you're writing a podcast episode, for example. Or heck, even if you're just experimenting with new clay for a potential new product you want to make. I know those first couple of things I throw don't turn out nearly as well as the third or the fourth ball of clay that I'm starting to center, right? So for focus time, you need 3 to 4 hours. And I know what all you side hustlers are thinking right now. I do not have 3 to 4 hours worth of uninterrupted time during my best times of the week. You have to be at work at 9 a.m. and you don't really get much say on that. I get it. So for the side hustlers, here are 2 options. Option number 1, you carve out 4 hours every Saturday and Sunday to make sure you at least get 2 blocks of focus time per week. If the goal is to launch your business and quit your job, it just might mean that instead of launching by the end of this year, we need to push that goal back to next spring. Option number 2, if you're sitting there thinking, nope, Rebecca, I cannot work 1 extra month in this job. I need out as soon as possible. Well, then you're going to have to commit to carving out focus time during the week, even when it seems impossible. It could mean that instead of waking up at the last possible moment to rush out the door to work, you have to set that alarm for the ungodly hour of 5 a.m. That way you get 3 hours of focus time in before you need to leave. Maybe it's asking your boss if you can work from 10 to 6 every day instead of 9 to 5, so you have more of that time in the morning. I keep suggesting the morning because, to be honest, I think that there are a lot less night owls in the world than the number of people who say they do their best work at night. I think some of that is actually just procrastination, and it actually stresses y'all out if you were to be real with yourselves. Although there are people, my husband included, who do clearly hit their stride after lunch and get way more done in the day later than earlier. If you're one of those people, then props to you. Maybe your focus time is going to have to be from 6 to 10 p.m. after work. Personally, and just my challenge for you to think about, I think that if you wait until 6 to 10 p.m., that's when you've already given a lot of your best energy to that full-time gig. And you'd be bringing your leftovers, effectively, to what's supposed to be your most important time. So, just be honest with yourself. I had this conversation with a coaching student of mine about a month ago. She was feeling frustrated because it felt like between work and family life, she was barely making headway on moving forward with her ceramics business. She'd been thinking about this business and wanting it for years, but she was feeling stuck, like she wasn't accomplishing anything that would move it forward. We discussed focus, flow, and flex, and I asked her when the times would be. A chunk of focus time in the morning was decided upon, but quickly she pointed out how that wouldn't work because she has to get the kids out the door to school. So I countered with, is it possible to have her husband take over the morning routine? Well, guess what? It was. Focus, flow, and flex sound simple, don't they? At least for me, they did. When I first learned these, I thought, that can't possibly be the entire solution. That's all you guys are doing? Really? But as I've learned over the years of actually trying to implement this system, just because it's simple doesn't mean it's easy. It's not easy to ask a partner to change the habits that your family is used to. But that doesn't mean they might not be willing to do it, to support you in your dreams. It's not easy asking a boss if you can adjust your hours, but it might actually be possible. You just have to ask. It's really easy for all of us to come up with reasons something is not possible. but usually that's based on a lot of assumptions. Consider what my life might look like if change was possible. Here's one thing for sure I can promise you, as I've experienced it for myself. Getting comfortable postponing the urgency of my inbox or whatever other urgent outside demands until later in the day and completing the big, audacious, important work on my wish list first, knowing it's the kind of work that's advancing the dreams I have for my life, moving those dreams forward, getting that stuff done first makes the entire rest of the day a win. The entire rest of the day's schedule could go to utter shit. And frankly, it did recently when I had to spend an unplanned afternoon driving to the Apple store trying to get my computer fixed, which, in the middle of the craziest time of year. But all of that was okay. Sure, it was annoying, but I wasn't nearly as stressed out about it as I normally would have been because the most important work was already done. Anything else I got finished after that was just a bonus. There's obviously more nuances that you'll find to make all of this work for your unique life. Maybe right now you can manage entire focus days and pair those with entire flow days. Sometimes I need to do that. Maybe it's only 3 to 4 hours of focus twice a week for now, on the weekends, like we said. Whatever it is, if you're feeling like the to-do list is impossibly long, I can assure you, implementing this approach, along with making sure you have the day's schedule prepared the night before, and are actually making a to-do list that's reasonable with how much time you have in the day, will help carve away at the impossibility. If this concept has piqued your interest and you want to chat more, by all means send me an email at Rebecca, Rebecca, at makers-playbook.com. As TJ was shocked to find out recently and told me so in an email, I do actually, personally, real life human over here, respond directly to every message. It might take me a couple of days because, as you know now, I am only doing it during my flow time, but I will always respond. Thank you so much for your continued support of this little podcast. If you have other maker friends you think would enjoy these chats, I'd love it if you shared a screenshot on Instagram and tagged me at the Maker's Playbook. Or, especially if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, leave a review of what you think. We're all battling the algorithm robots over here, and I would so appreciate your help. Apple Podcasts especially love reviews. As I mentioned in last week's episode, we're taking our first season break after this week. I'm going to be resharing some of our most popular episodes from the past year over the month of September, and be back with new conversations with amazing makers like Sunshine Cobb, Greta Michelle, and Rosa Wiland Holmes from the Great Pottery Throw Down, just to name a few, and to keep you anxiously waiting for October. If you want to be sure not to miss any of those new episodes when they do go live, then make sure to sign up for our newsletter, which can be found at makers-playbook.com/newsletter. In the meantime, as always, I will be sending out our monthly photography tips email, which is coming next week. So if you aren't already on the list, stop this podcast episode right now and be sure to go click the link in the description to get our free at-home photography cheat sheet, which will put you on the email list for all of the monthly free photo tips. And these tips are specifically geared for ceramicists and makers. All of these links can be found just by opening up the description of this episode on whatever podcast app you are using, or you can find the full show notes, which are on our website, www.makers-playbook.com. All right, my friends, until October, go get back to making your dreams a reality, because together, we've got this.